first thing, the thank yous go all one way at this point, because first of all, thank you for venturing into that misbegotten file of the alpha, which basically is too bad. I'm just annotating the core books, so read both. Good luck. And then the second is blogging about it, which is fantastic. I mean, I couldn't ask for anything nicer, really. And then, of course, agreeing to talk.
Oh no, sure.
To tell me a little bit more about playing. I mean, have you role played with your daughter before, one-on-one? Is this something you guys do? Okay, cool.
Not one-on-one. That part's a new thing for us.
Mm-hmm.
She was. I have a home-based gaming group, and she was folded into that when she turned, I think, probably about 12.
Mm-hmm.
She's 15 now,
mm-hmm.
and so last couple of years she's sat at the table with other adults and other youth, and we've done superhero role-playing games before as a group with, I would say, mixed success. And but when this one came out, I was looking for an opportunity to really do some things one-on-one with her, just as a father. And we have a 15-year-old teenage girl. You look for everything to connect with.
Anything, right?
Exactly. I'll go to that Taylor Swift concert with you, sure.
Yeah, really.
And, but she really loves the superhero genre a lot, and so when I kickstarted the rules and was thinking, man, I don't know this would be a thing for the whole group, just because of who they are and the genre itself and everything else. This is the same time that Abby was developing her own story and her own characters, and so to say, wow, I can connect with her, try out a game with somebody who would love the genre, and the best part is that we already have this kind of pre-built universe.
Right, you've got content.
She's done exactly. Yeah. So it just worked great, and it has been just a lot of fun and a wonderful thing for her and I to do together. So
you have 4 episodes blogged at the moment. Have you played past the introduction of Ultraviolet? That's
or her villainous identity, Dark Matter. Mm-hmm. She's playing both sides of the fence.
Exactly. That's what I mean. It's when Ultraviolet, gets introduced, so to speak.
We actually have a couple of sessions that I haven't written up.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
And so continuing to explore some plot lines and to introduce some more characters and watch the universe slowly build. And so we have a couple more that are on the books, but haven't been written up yet. Just haven't sat down and had a chance to do that last couple of weeks. But we continue to we try to get about one session in a week, just try to find a short time to sit down.
It's the write-up that takes the time, really, in comparison.
And the sessions can be anywhere from less than an hour to a solid couple of hours of afternoon time. When it's one-on-one, you can get a lot done.
Absolutely. So I wanted to point out one or two things before before you get to talk most. Which is, first of all, I am a huge sucker for villain protagonists or semi-villain heroes, and I'm just nuts for them, and have always written extensively on my comics blog about villains as protagonists. I've got quotes from every comic book writer saying that you can only write comics if you love the villains the most, and so on and so forth.
Totally true.
Yeah, so all of that, and it's why people say, why do you like to GM champion? It's like, well, so I can play the villains. I mean, that's why I want to do it. There's no other reason, And so then the other thing too is that I'm really liking is the fact that, just what you said a minute ago, the world building around the activity of play. And it's an enormous issue for first generation champions, which has no canonical setting. And and so, like, the authors, they just knew that you would be making your own comic. And even though they
Yes,
give
right.
various, resources, they're always framed as examples, not as, game setting for you to
Right.
play. And so it seems to me that playing Champions seems to have branched over the years into a sort of different
Sure.
way, and so therefore it's really interesting to come back to this and see people discover it.
Yeah.
Right. And
And
so
yeah, it's been for me, like, and I bought first edition Champions in the store. Like,
mhm,
it was probably the third role playing game I ever played
mhm,
as a child, with D&D and the old FOSSA Star
mhm.
Trek being the first two.
Yes.
So I'm that old.
Yeah, I'm a wee bit older. I date back to Melee and Wizard and Holmes D&D.
And so the idea that you had a game in which you had to fill it all in, and there has never, I mean, even when fourth edition did Champions Universe and they said, here's our world book, it was never the idea of like, so you're going to play in this, like,
Mhm.
this is the place you have to go. And it was kind of cool because having a player built sandbox in some ways, she's totally invested in it. And one thing I had to be careful about was that what I did with it didn't kind of mess with her own canon.
That's a
Like,
slightly trickier thing. I mean, the role of GM, the role of player in this game in particular, is
Right.
not quite as clear cut as world builder and thespian.
Right.
In
Like,
the
I'm
first
just gonna
place, I
drop
mean,
you into my thing.
if I write a hunted on my sheet, I expect you to freaking play my hunted as your guy. I mean, there's already a bleed there that's very productive, I think. But then
Well,
to
yeah.
juxtapose that with the author of separate fiction is a little tricky. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
she had, when we play, one of the things that I said was like, look, I'm going to leave your story alone. Like,
right.
you wrote the graphic novel, like, you did all that work. She has a graphic novel that she wrote herself that she has on her
Hmm.
bookshelf.
Hmm.
And I said, we're gonna do a different school, and I'm gonna do all new teachers and all
Right.
new students.
She's going to
And
go over there and be there for a semester
right.
and so on.
And
Yeah, so it's
so
fan. And it's kind of funny. It's like fanfic. You get to write your own. The author gets to participate in the fanfic. Yeah,
I'm participating in a fan fiction of my daughter's work.
right, right.
And,
Woo! Words I never expected to hear in one sentence.
and it's funny because every once in a while she'll say something like, oh, I like this teacher better than I like the teacher that I had at my university,
Right, right.
And every once in a while she'll try to game it a little bit and be like, well, can I draw upon something from my story?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, well, that's not, I don't want that to be a bag of holding that you can pull anything you want out of it.
Didn't I get the transmodulator from so and so? It's like,
exactly.
well, actually,
I'm gonna call my Uncle Phil from the other story because he can do anything for me.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's in many ways when the graphic novel by the different author and artist comes out about the beloved character, and then the fans write in and say, what about Uncle Phil? And they just said, well, not in that graphic novel.
Yeah, right, exactly. You have to sort of had to set some boundaries there. And but no, I get that. And it's but we've had a really good experience with it, and she's totally hooked on it. And for me, it's been great because I've learned a lot about what keeps people coming back over and over again, and there's a certain kind of pacing and storyline we do to this kind of genre and this kind of story that's been really helpful for me. So
wow, both of those are topics I'd love to delve into, and I hope I don't forget them in the time we have available. One, absolutely. Just to remind myself, one was why people come back,
right,
and then two is the nature of pacing of plot and events and reactions, particularly, and just to pick an example, particularly relative to fights in this genre.
Right.
That is a fascinating topic because we have two really distinct example GMs from the 80s for Champions to compare.
Right.
Both of whom wrote extensively. One of which is Aaron Alston,
Own the original book.
Right,
Yeah.
me too. And that book in particular is very powerful because he makes no bones about it. This was built through play. Character arcs happen and are developed. You commit to the character arc, not to the arc's outcome. Right. You know, and you don't know you're on the arc until you're kind of on it, right? And you're invested in it. And then you have Dennis Maloney, who was kind of the opposite. He was kind of like, you got your fixed epic. You've got the Dark Phoenix saga, and the players are going to love it. And so they're very different ways of writing. You can read their supplements, you can read their adventures. They have very explicit philosophical statements, and they are night and day. So so it's really interesting to talk about how does a GM who likes the first kind, the Alston method, basically.
Right.
How does a GM, and don't get seduced by the beauty of Strike Force once it's done, right? You know, in other words, you don't go backwards. You know, you don't try and make that happen. You found you did it.
No,
and so
you can't.
Yeah. So, but the point being, how then, in the face of a session, do you pace things without railroading?
Right.
And that's a very subtle issue, and I've been writing about it for decades, really. Right. So I'm going to kind of leave that. I'm just leaving those as these two really great topics which explode into seminars. And then what I want to ask you about, though, is Selfish.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Talk to me about the features of champions now in the alpha, as you perceive them, that played any role in your experience, and what you were thinking when you encountered them, and how they worked out if you employed them, stuff like that. Yeah.
And I can say that my own larger gaming group just played within the last year. We trotted out the most recent iteration of Hero Games as Champions.
I saw your blog post about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we got 400-point characters with everything. And then I went and did 250-point characters using Champions Now, and with a admittedly smaller group and a more receptive audience.
Right.
And was immediately struck by the very different ethos and style of gameplay and character creation and all those things, and reminded me, as somebody who remembered the original game, and my own history is that I jumped from 1 to 4.
Right. Man, you're talking about like this shitty mimeograph thing. It was probably bootlegged on the school Ditto machine. Right?
I bought the book.
Yeah.
And, I was gonna say, like, when I saw your copies of that you're sent out to everyone, I said I might have a better copy at home somewhere that I could grab for you.
Right.
But when I bought the first book, inhaled it, folded it in, obsessed about it, but somehow missed, because I wasn't plugged into the game store scene, that there had been future supplements. And then I go off to college, and I'm whipping out my first edition book, and they're like, "Hey, any of you guys play this?" And they break out the 4th edition Big Blue book and go, "Oh, you don't know. There's this book right here."
Yeah, it's tricky though, because Champions 2nd and 3rd edition are properly understood as refinements of the first. They're not too different, and there's 1 or 2 rules changes that that different people are committed to in different ways. But the Champions supplements, called 2 and 3, which is not the same as 2nd and 3rd edition, which makes no sense, but right. So anyway, those 2 supplements actually are themselves gold mines of different ways to approach champions.
Right.
You have the one person who wants you to build bases brick by brick, point by point, right? And then you have this other person who's talking all about, listen, this game is all about motivations, so it's real different. Right. But but to go on, though, what I'm trying to say is, looking at those rules, this set, what did you do with them?
Well, I think that one of the things that I did is, when you do a superhero game, how people approach it differs wildly. And I think one of the things that you can do when you play superheroes is to say, I want to build a power. I want to build a set of powers that is efficient and cool and allows me to win fights. And when I was looking at, going back to when I went to Champions Now, I always say going back to Champions Now. When I went to Champions Now, I realized that you can't build that character. You have to build something that is, one, a little bit less powerful, but two, it allows you to really focus on who the person is. So, like, I'm a big Legion of Superheroes fan from the day. Like that. That's and some of those guys. Like, I have one power. I can breathe fire.
Right. Well, yeah, except that if you really look at it in the book, what he's really got is a variable power pool.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's doing whatever with it. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And but the focus was on the person and the dynamics. And, it was, you had some really powerful characters out there, but that wasn't, those guys didn't, there wasn't a sense of imbalance there. Everybody had a role to play. And so, even when I was building characters in the story, I build a 200-point character, and that'd be fine because that was who he was, and that was what I was shooting for, and there wasn't that sense of like the goal was to build a character that was great for the story, not I need to build the best combat unit
it's tricky to keep thinking about this. In my experience, I was a big fan of a phrasing somewhere in those early texts that talked about how playing with lighter built characters who used the rules and the teamwork, you use the rules, they use the teamwork very effectively, would just eat the lunch of some multi-point lummox. And I actually experimented with that in one of my recent games with a group of opponents who were quite small in points. But the way that they did things, and even a 4x6 energy blast built as explosion, but with full knockback.
Right.
Really will wreak havoc, among what the other characters are trying to do. If you've got more points than me, but you're spending half your time standing up.
And if you're just trying to do, one thing I thought about in terms of the rules was if you're just going to do a very simple straight build, if you have 5 points and you're trying to figure out what you do with those 5 points. You drop those 5 points into defense, or you drop those 5 points into 1d6 energy blast. The defense is going to win out because the only time in which you're going to actually damage that person is when you roll a 6.
Right. So
if you don't start getting creative with some things in terms of how you play it, or using the environment, or coming up with alternatives than just I'm going to slam heads with this person like 2 rams in a pen.
Well, that's exactly it. And if you look at the comics in particular, the ones that really inspired the game, which are the ones you're talking about, right? The 70s Legion, Dave Cockrum Legion, right? And obviously, the X-Men, the new X-Men. And you recognize that most of the opponents are considerably more powerful than the heroes. That the heroes cannot just go and wipe the floor of them because they're tougher. It had to do with the tactics of the moment, and it had to do with it's why I was emphasizing special effects so much.
Right.
That you can alter any power in the moment based on what it does as a fictional quantity. And
there's a great example in the Champions sort of mythos. In the Strike Force book, which you and I both have, but maybe everybody who's watching this don't. There's a moment in which Alston pits deliberately underpowered opponents against his base team.
Right.
And they shellac him, and because he's like, let me show you like how.
Right. That's what I was referring to a bit ago. Yeah, it's exactly what I was referring to. Yeah.
And so then the player group goes, oh, like. if we don't adapt how we're playing to a way that again emulates certain comic books, then we could be beaten by these guys every time because they're a better superhero team than we are.
They're more organized. And I also tried to emphasize that, and I'm emphasizing now, especially when in my more built-up villain section.
Right.
Villains want things. If you want to play a productive way to play is that a character that we are going to designate, for lack of a better word, a villain, is there for something that they want to do.
Right.
And we have to kind of get away from the lazy side of writing that our friends and your friends and mine at DC have occasionally fallen into, which is that they're either robbing a bank or they're kidnapping a mayor.
yeah, right.
And
exactly.
Let's kind of get away from that and talk about characters who really want something, and they're going to do it. And if beating the hero or not, maybe losing to the hero, is not going to work for that,
right,
then it's just not their priority. And I often think it's kind of funny. I'm looking at especially some of the old Lee Spider-Mans. When the villain is exasperated, they're like, go away. It's like Spider-Man's like, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to kick your butt. And he's like, why do you care? I have this thing to do. I'm going to go and kill that crime boss, right?
Right. Yeah.
I'm paid. I know why I'm here. Why are you here?
And, well, a friend of mine who's also a superhero GM said that writing good villains means the villains rarely think about the superheroes being there.
Right.
They're going to do their own thing, and it's the moment in which you try to figure out how to bring the hero into the story in such a way that they realize if I don't do anything, they're going to go ahead and succeed in their goals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the default villain gets the job done. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the trick is how do you create that story with people playing heroes that you don't fall into the lazy super friends where they're all sitting around the table and the Justice League trouble alert goes on and right.
Well, comics have fallen into comics themselves have fallen into that. There was always Cerebro, right? We'll have our danger scene room, and then Cerebro will go off, and then we're going to go do something. And then there's the bat signal, of course, which is slightly more justified in a sort of plot-ish way. And then you also have there's a variety.
Yeah, right.
Spider Sense has been abused many times. Here I am, do Spider Sense. Well, I think I should go find the plot, and that's all true. And I talk a little bit about that and ways in which it can be more satisfying when it's a desperation device, when it's fun. Right. But the thing that I want to go for is looking at the builds in Champions now. You were talking. I think it's not just the lower points.
Yeah, I think it's also, I don't know. I think that at some point it became, particularly as you got into. I mean, I didn't even really touch 5th and 6th edition.
Right.
When you have a book that literally stop a bullet. I've seen that YouTube video where the guy shoots the 5th edition book and the bullet doesn't go through. That the rules became very reactive to player abuse. That became. It became sort of shockingly legalistic. We're anticipating all the ways in which a player is going to screw in these rules in order to in many ways wreck a campaign.
There was the notion of the default player as a spoiler really crept into the hero system culture at some point. Right.
And so when you have a thing where it's instead more as you say. You give a little more slop in the rules to allow you to encourage the player to say, I'd like to try to do this. There's a moment, and I don't know if it's reflected in the blog post where, my Dark Matter, I think she's actually in her villain identity at this point, is being pursued by a hero, and. She's not effectively going toe to toe with this guy, and she says, is there a building around somewhere that I could like knock over on them? Or, like you start to, this is something that I think actually one of the RPGs that my gaming group did, actually it's one of the first ones that my daughter did, was Marvel Heroic Role Playing.
Yes.
Which was like way over on the other side of the spectrum rules-wise.
Yeah.
But really encouraged people to, they rewarded players for saying things like, what's around me?
Absolutely.
Like, what's in the environment?
Yeah.
How can I come up with something?
We did that in Champions a lot. One of that leads me to think in terms of place. I don't want to say setting. I want to say location.
Right.
Because for me, it was always about playing in real cities. Now, I know that's not required, but to do so was extremely, extremely satisfying a lot of the time. And I'm looking around. Here we are. I was showing this off in a recent play session. This is from the early 90s, I think, from when I was visiting Chicago again after living there for a long time playing Champions. But I picked this up. This is the brochure from the Sears Tower. Each quadrant shows you the view from the top of the Sears Tower. So you're looking across. And look at that, though. I mean, you've got all you need. I mean, we lived there, too, so we knew the distances. You got all you need for fantastic. There's your map. And we did that a lot, even without such a device. In a lot of locations. When I lived in Florida, it was set in Tampa, and people in the game knew Tampa really well. Oh, okay. And so people in the game knew Tampa really well, and so locations were huge. We knew where everything was. We're doing the same thing in all my games right now, in all my Champions games. It's exceptionally powerful because people are always... The richness of the environment for people to reach out and get something or make use of something in some way is extraordinarily strong, and that matches the naturalism. Well, I say naturalism. It's that artificial now of the monthly comic.
Right.
It's coming out in month by month by month, but it's taking place in kind of a real time of its own. But that real time of its own is supposed to be here. And that's okay. Never mind what's inconsistent, They fixed the Statue of Liberty's hand. Come on. Keep going, right? Never mind. And so to me, that's extremely productive. And in role-playing, it's extremely liberating compared to the featureless environment, except for what the GM says. You go into the 10 by 30 room. There's the table on the left. There's the curtain. There's the goblin, and that's what's there. And then there's the other side, which says, there's this setting, and, you're not allowed to touch the setting. That's the GM's baby. So you're reduced to saying, is there, can I, is there, in a very, can I touch it way. The way you're talking about and the way I'm experiencing for Champions is a little different. It's kind of like they say can I or is there, but it's a different feel. It's much more of a, well, of course there is. I'm letting you know that I'm going to.
Right.
Nobody's going to say, if you're fighting in the garage in the dark, right? So you're in this desperate fight in this garage in the dark, and you don't have, like, light 'em all up powers or something, and it's really actually kind of dangerous. And you're like, as I'm knocked back through here, and the GM says, all these tools rattle around you, and like, I grab the crowbar. If you say, is there a crowbar, the GM's not going to say no.
Right.
It's all there to be done. It's right there to be done. It's ridiculous to say no. And so, that kind of, again, that's that weird bleed that goes on that I think is almost unique to playing Champions in this fashion. That's
right, because there's a balance there between that's what I like about it, is that there's just sort of a spectrum of that kind of level of detail versus what you can do and what you can introduce versus what's been preset, and trying to hit that middle spot somewhere where the player feels like they're comfortable and there's a certain agency about it, while at the same time
they can't do anything though. Right? Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
It's very seeing how often players say, "I get to a certain spot, so I can do something like that." They actually have a certain sense of finite opportunity somehow. You're right. That is an interesting thing, but I've observed it again and again. It's not like some happy circumstance that I get because I'm Magic GM. It's something that actually does develop pretty consistently in other applications of this, and I was really trying to foster that, in here. So yeah, I like that.
It's working well for us. Like
Excellent.
I said, we're having
appreciate it.
It's
it's a great thing to read. I mean, the fun one. Here's one thing I'm liking. Your NPCs are hugely entertaining and aggravating. Right? I mean, as soon as you say Captain, you sold me on Captain Hollywood, right? Instantly. And so the fact that the word I want actually is a little bit of audacity. And I think I don't want to criticize different editions of Champions, but looking at the material from the very first publications to the later ones, with some exceptions. I can think of some exceptions. But and I'm also thinking of Villains and Vigilantes at the same time.
Right.
There seems to have been kind of a steady decrease in that audacity. You know what that means? I mean, and again, I can think of a couple of exceptions. There's some really great villains in later Champion supplements that pop up every so often.
Right.
But the general sense that the villains are here to just make you do a double take, and comparing to take two very similar examples, Shrinker in first edition Champions, first or second, and then Mocker, if you remember from the Crisis at the Crusader Citadel from Villains and Vigilantes, right, which was the guy with the great big globy head with the big grin on it, and he was this android who made like fart noises and like obnoxious noises and funny noises as a distraction when he did his thing, and you're like, that is the oddest thing, And you're like, okay, we're running with it, And pretty soon the players are completely engaged in it, and they kind of like the fact that their comic has this whacked stuff in it.
I think sometimes the villains in the back of like the first books were there just like, let me show you how to build this archetypical character.
Sure.
So
right.
So they're a little two dimensional that way. But if you when I was a teenager and was formulating all these ideas about what I liked, what I didn't like, there was a television show. It was the Japanese animated superhero show, which you didn't see a lot of in the day, and it was called the Bionic Six. And the Bionic Six were the 6 most boring superheroes you could ever possibly imagine. They all had almost identical powers. They were a family. The only they had going for it that I like: white toast, largely perfect, boring, and then they had 6 counterpoint villains. Like a family of villains and a family of heroes, and the villains were all bizarre and they were highly defective, and the villain himself possessed like significant flaws. And I think the writers realized like where the story was, because when you start watching the episodes, you realize that they're spending of a half-hour episode. You have 20 minutes
of the villains doing stuff. Time. Exactly.
They're hanging out at their base, and they're screwing over each other. And then the heroes sort of show up to like foil it.
Exactly. And,
you're almost at that moment where you're like, man, I would really love for the villains to win.
That's right. Well, I've been, it sounds like, why a comic hasn't been done with that, as you describe, as pretty much the basic approach, I'll never know, because it's there to be done. But
and there's more incentive, and I just felt like and a flawed character is a better character,
of course,
and which some players don't get, but also too, there's just so much more opportunity for development. And one of the things that I really appreciated when when my daughter came to me and was like, I want to play a villain. I have this villainous character. And I said, and it was a little weird because my daughter's she's not a bad kid. She's not a person who acts out in school. She's not particularly, one of these sort of dark, troublemaking. I'm gonna hang out backyard and smoke. And I was like, well, why does dark matter? Why is she a villain? Like, what's her
what's that even mean? Right. Yeah.
And because do you want to hurt people? Do you want to steal stuff? And she's like, no, I want to conquer the world because I know how the world could be a better place. Like, I'm going to be a benevolent dictator.
It's like, a Junior Doom, right?
That's right. Like, I know.
Dr. Doom wakes up in the hospital and says, I have goals.
Exactly right.
I went to that motivational seminar, and the first thing they said was, know your goals. Check.
Exactly. And when you're an idealistic, teenager, you may say to yourself, like, I'm going to overthrow the man.
Oh yeah, easy.
And so
I feel that way myself on occasion. Yeah.
And so when I talk to her about because every once in a while I'll say to myself, does she actually want to like play somebody who wants to hurt someone?
Right.
No.
Right.
She wants to play somebody who can get her way, shape the world to her own image because she knows she's right. I think most villains don't sit around going, we're going to call ourselves the Legion of Evil.
That's right.
Because
well, it's pretty much on record of the two authors who come to mind right out of the bat. One is Stan Lee, who was very explicit. He said, every villain is a hero in their own mind. And
exactly.
And they need to make some sense in that. They actually do need to make some sense for that to really fly. And then you got to think about why they think that. They're not just crazy. And then Denny O'Neil said something very similar in that the villain's activities are what make the story engaging. The hero is what makes the story kind of confirming, or kind of, what's the word? It elevates the story. But the person who makes the story there to be elevated is the villain.
Right.
And
I think it's what made like the X-Men work so well was that the X-Men really weren't heroes. In fact, for a lot of time, the X-Men were villains. In terms of the world looked at them and said,
right,
those guys are freaks, they're weirdos, they're allegories for something else. But they had their own goal that was not, we're going to go out there and fight crime. They were like, no, we're going to go out there and like save our people and protect them from, the
Marvel shift. The Marvel shift was big on that. The idea of the superhero as a deputized cop or government agent. They had a couple of characters who sort of fell into that, but it never was a good fit. No. Captain America in particular was a really, if he was a government agent, he was a really shitty one. But
well, they played that. They worked that storyline a bit where they said, here's your op, you work for us, or turn over the shield. Yeah. And they've played that story about 3 or 4 times. Right.
But it's kind of the only thing to do with the character. Otherwise, he's just a stooge.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. And they had this stooge version.
So, right. No, I remember. So that.
One of the things that's been really helpful in terms of just keeping the story going is that you have a character who has goals that are proactive and not reactive. So they're not, one thing that oftentimes sometimes found when I was gaming superhero stories is that they'd be like,
villain of the week, man. Throw them at us.
What are you guys doing? And they're like, oh, I guess I'm on patrol.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to be. But I always appreciated that my daughter's characters, even in those stories, she'd be like, I'm going to start a business.
Right. Yeah. I get that. Now, what's weird is that since I emphasize so strongly those elements of character design that are not paid with points.
Right.
That in some ways it's a bit liberating because you're not, and I actually like point build systems. I'm not saying otherwise. Right. What I am saying is that the parts that aren't built with points are the parts that you realize, well, I could change just with activity.
Right.
And
or even role playing. You're not paying for contacts anymore.
Right. And so I've definitely, I don't know if you've seen my blog posts about the way I saw first generations come to a full stop.
Right.
And then fourth draws more on GURPS than it does from first generation champions.
Oh, I think that's fair.
Yeah, and so that's no slam on anybody. It's the way the wind blew at the time. And if you look at the teams involved, the team for fourth edition was completely different people. The whole Steve Peterson, George, Greg McDonald, all the rest of it, that was gone. They just didn't participate. So I mean, it's easy to say there was a full stop and a drawing on a different body of work. And the goal was to make the hero system, of which Champions was a part. Before that point, they used the word hero system occasionally, but it was a gleam in their eye. It wasn't. It didn't. There really wasn't one. So what I guess I'm saying is, looking at that standpoint and thinking in terms of character arc as we discover it, thinking in terms of both unpaid things and paid things at the same time, and then looking at disadvantages in particular. And this is what I wanted to ask you about. Disadvantages in particular as a crisscrossing set of plot devices and richness to draw upon. The one thing you mentioned, 6th edition, and 6th edition is perfectly correct in saying these aren't really disadvantages. I'm still calling them that in my text, but if I come up with a different name, I will, because they are. No, I want my character to have all those. I don't.
Right.
So it's not like people talk about buying off disadvantages, and I don't think I ever saw anybody did that in the history of the entire game.
I've never known anyone never buy off a disadvantage.
Exactly, and so you kind of say, well, all right. Let's look at those. So what kind of disadvantages does dark matter have? What are they?
So she picked, when we were putting it together, and it was I had a lot of hand in it because I knew the rules better than she did, but we did have a sit down and kind of talk about these things. She was so much more interested in things like familial obligations, or I mean, she knocks out the quick, couple of law enforcement related hunted. So, but one of the things that she had even developed in her own story, the hero antagonist in her own story, the story that she wrote, was a quasi romantic interest. So so that was, that was a big, part of her previous story arc was an antagonist for whom she had a complex relationship with. So, you already have situations in which she's not thinking about that in terms of, is this bad? It's more like, is this complicating?
That's why Steve called them complications in 6th, which makes sense. And I also, if you kind of look at the writings that I was referring to earlier, they were very big on taking a villain as a DNPC instead of a hunted. They were very big on psychological limitations that were points of crisis for you. They weren't, and that you suffered because of this. And if you look at some of the better enemies books, they offer some of the characters offer some really great examples of contradictory psychological limitations, or contradictions between a psychological limitations and a nominal hunter. You're kind of like, if those two things are happening at the same time, that person's going to make some really weird decisions. And
we kind of introduced like the idea of like a social complication. If that makes any sort of sense. Like, it's not, this is like she has, like, for example, she has a psychological limit. I should just print out her character sheet. She has a psychological limitation about the fact that she is always extremely invested in the bad things that are happening to her friends. So she's not somebody who's going to ignore her friends all the time. So we built in the story hook of, every time somebody in the story has a problem, she's going to feel she can't ignore it. She has to, even if she doesn't even like the person, she's just kind of like a born meddler. Yeah,
well, it's kind of that's kind of an odd sort of DNPC circle of friends kind of thing,
Exactly, and she even sort of characterized it that ways.
Right.
We talked about like her roommate might be a specific DNPC, and I need to put her in the story more.
Cool. Well,
go ahead.
go ahead.
But they also said like like the social obligations of her family. So she feels a tremendous pressure to be a good villain, and she's always sort of very mindful of this deep desire to want to represent well and succeed and everything else. Because one of the kind of cool dynamics is that every character in her group has like a sponsor, and so there's a little bit of that sense of like, you know, my family's better than your family, or
my backer is better than your backer, right?
Yeah, and
right.
so she often is, you know, often tries to role play out, you know, the social stress of like, I'm having to, you know, like I can't let the family down,
right?
And so there's a lot of drama for that, and so it was funny because, you know, when I said you have to have different kinds of different limitations. And then you get around to like vulnerabilities, and she's just like, meh.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Now I've found, well, one thing I've liked is that cap of 50 points per type that I did.
Right.
Really actually led people to want to go big on a category or two. And so now I prompted this to some extent, but one of the characters in our current game, the one that I just finished, in fact, the last time I'm playing with the alpha. From it's all beta from now on, but the character from the long-running alpha game had a susceptibility, a vulnerability, and a dependence on the exact same weird substance.
Okay.
So ended up.
So it's around, but if somebody else gets a hold of it, I'm gonna be in trouble.
Right, exactly, and I need it, you know, and it's so I need it, and then if don't get away from it, then I'll take it's ridiculous, and of course,
like a codependent, it's like
completely,
something like a codependent.
Right, and
I want this, but it's not really good for me.
Exactly, and of course the players like playing it up. There's all kinds of fun things that have happened with it, and it's the same thing with DNPCs. If you say, I'm going to go big, I'm going to get a bunch, and this is going to be interesting. I'm going to pick. It's not going to be just like the postman and my girlfriend and this and that. I want a little constellation here. You know, I want this node on my sheet of trouble, and I'm looking at that. I've been through the disadvantages very carefully toward that end. I've made a few changes about them that I think will work very well for it. But what I got rid of was the notion of a psychological limitation as an alignment of what you can or cannot do. That has always cause trouble.
It's a cheap 20 points to get code versus killing.
But then what do you do with it, actually? Doesn't mean you do or you don't. Doesn't mean you want to, but anyway, on and on. All of a sudden, you know, the tabletop battles begin and not the good kind. So, exactly. So getting rid of that, and then also, instead of going for all the frequency-based, like, and I know that it's sort of one of those charming but ultimately not very functional things. You know, roll 14 or less, that villain shows up, and I framed it differently, and I also framed it differently in terms of villain motivations. So are they out to ruin you, or are they out to, you know, murder you, basically?
Yeah, or study or whatever. There's complexity there. Yeah, the problem I always had with like the, you know, 11 or less or 14 or less or 8 or less is that in some ways it felt a little bit like the Team Rocket syndrome, you know, where you have like you have the story that you're telling, and you're like, oh yeah, I rolled this thing, they gotta
right, and then
throw them in, smack them around, then they leave, you come back again.
For me, I just always forgot to do it.
Oh yeah,
I would just forget as I prepped. I mean,
you would never have your own story. You got 8 players. You know, 3 of them would have a villain show up, and so you're like, well.
And then there's the whole show up. Anyway, we've all adapted it. You know, to I sort of adapted it into a frequency thing where I was like, okay, how long has it been? Well, he's only an 8 or less, so I'm going to let him stew a little longer. Then I'll bring him in later.
Exactly.
You know, that kind of thing. But the thing I'm trying to get at is that I really like the idea of the disadvantages as embraced by the player and full of consequence, full of things to do.
Right.
So
exactly.
And I'm seeing that in Ultraviolet, in the write-ups. I mean, she's just like, It's kind of like she wakes up in the morning. She's all right. Now, what does the world? It's like Peter Parker. All right, world. What do you got today? Who's walking in the door? Who's it going to be?
And there is, I think that helped when you have like the classroom setting where you walk into class, you sit down, and the professor says, "Oh, by the way, we got a visiting supervillain today." That does give you some ability to do plot structure. But if you see the disadvantages as things that are exciting and that drive the plot and you enjoy it, rather than things to be avoided or worked around.
Well, that's why sort of the whole there are games in which the disadvantages are all pathologies of some kind. The psych ones are always hardcore neuroses. The physical ones are serious disabilities.
Yeah, there's got to be something where it engages the player and not. Yeah.
Most of the ones in Champions were a little different, though. And you can really see it when... And you see, we also have the interesting twist of GURPS Supers coming out in 1989. And so...
it's an Ouroboros.
Yeah, completely. Well, it always... It even goes back before Champions. I mean, you go all back to the way the Melee and Wizard, and you see where Champions combat came from. There's always been the twist and turn. But those... I mean, and I've talked to the people in question. They all knew... It wasn't like a bad thing. They were all just playing each other's games. That's all. And so the interesting thing in this case, though, is that when GURPS by itself comes out, all of the disadvantages are all these fairly gruesome things that you don't want. And it was fairly clear. It was explicitly stated, disadvantages are crap, And then you don't want this. And then you go to GURPS Supers and you see how they diddle the disadvantages to make them desirable again.
Right.
And you can kind of say, Lloyd Blankenship was the author. You can kind of say, I see your point. You just gotta, you gotta reverse this. Disadvantages are things that you trowel on because you want them. And so, I was to go back to Ultraviolet. I'm really, really interested, if you would, and I know it's asking you a favor. If you could scan her sheet, and I don't know if this is possible, like in the original versus the after 4 sessions. Has she been spending experience points? Has that been going on?
We have been dumping some experience points in.
Right. Because they matter.
And it's just been, and it's been mostly tweaking. She's mostly used them to add the odd D6 to a power.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the stuff is more sort of intangible, and it's funny that they do matter, but they don't matter that much. Like, it's not that sense of, man, I've got a goal of gonna power this thing up and be a better fighter and whatever else. Because I think that if we were playing in a different edition, she'd be dumping all of her points into contacts and the small point stuff. Right. She's like, I've got a workable energy blast. I'm feeling pretty good.
There's some interesting things about the way experience points work in first generation that I tried to bring forward and really make them work in this, which is very much rounding out the character as they are. So even though you just bought it, the implication is that they could have done it all along. It's just that now we see them do it.
Right.
And so that happens, and you can do that all the time, and then when you want to, you can have like a in-fiction change too.
Right.
But you're not forced to have in-fiction changes. Oh, my energy blast is getting more powerful, No, all you're really saying is that the artist is getting better at drawing.
Right.
And so,
it is sort of the question of, like, there's been very few superheroes out there in the world who have gotten more powerful over time, like in the narrative build. Like,
it's tricky.
Said,
there's unintended creep simply because the writers need to do something more, and the artists in particular want to draw more, and then you get a new writer who, kind of just writes it differently and better in some ways. If you have Batman say, surprise somebody out of the shadows one time in a relatively mundane way, you can bet that 10 years down the road, they're going to have him practically invisible. I mean,
Or
it's
teleporting away.
Yeah, pretty much. And so you pretty much have to kind of accept that there's this kind of weird creep that occurs without without a justified in-fiction change happening.
Right.
It's not like Batman gets powers that makes him stealthy or anything like that.
Right. One of my favorite characters, just because in some ways I just not because I loved having him be a part of the gaming group or whatever, but just because I loved how the player understood his character. Is I had a guy who wanted to play like this super martial artist, and so we always used to laugh because he could justify he bought all these powers and was always, this is just martial arts.
Of course.
Martial arts.
Well, I'm a huge fan of that, obviously. So yeah, it's like
he was building his character, and he took direction sense as one of the was the 4th edition, and we said direction sense. Okay, I guess that's kind of your. He goes, no. I just want to use direction sense to do one thing. I always want to know where the moon is, so when I leap up, it's behind me.
Oh, there you go. Lovely. Yeah, exactly.
You're like,
the visuals really matter. Yeah,
I respect that a lot.
Yeah, and I do too. My favorite is a character built in that fashion. If the player takes this little special effort to trash talk the supers around him by saying, "Yeah, but I'm just a man," even though he's got all these powers built on him in the sheet. Fictionally, he's just a guy, and he milks it for all he's worth, as for like a little. Give me a little credit here. I'm the one with my fists, and so you got your Nova Blast. I've got my fists, and you're kind of like, yeah, but you got more points in your fist than I have in my Nova Blast.
Exactly right. Yeah, so, built up my damage, whatever dice to go up to
whatever it is.
But no, I'd be happy to go ahead and post
that would be wonderful,
or Dark Matter, whichever one you want to call her, character, and because she's in some ways has a somewhat unremarkable build. I mean, she's
that's not that surprising. I am prone myself to making weird little crisscrosses and funky tricks and builds that are interesting.
Right.
Not point saving, as you saw the ratio. I'm actually, I actually put a real nasty elbow down on just point launchering. But still, there's way to crisscross the way the character is written and the way the power works that can make it, sometimes I get a little too overboard with that. In fact, I always get a little overboard with that. And I kind of envy the character who is a simple build, and then you look at what the character's like and you go, wow. I mean, that's one reason why I try to emphasize you can get a variable power pool, a multi-power, or an elemental control, but just for a second, breathe a second, and look at those few characters in the comics that clearly have no such thing.
Right.
And you will find that they are psychologically and socially profoundly well placed.
Right.
And that's an interesting lesson. You don't have to do it. It's fun with mess with the points, but pay attention to the lesson. There's something there. So
she's just a straight up simple multi-power with an energy blast and flight in it, and martial arts, and just to keep her sort of a little survivable, we put in the armored costume and a couple of skills and you're done. And there's really. And it's for her. It's always been about the story and about the interactions, and she's half as likely to the player. My daughter is just as half as likely to avoid the fight or try to figure out a way around it, just because she's also gotten beat up. But also, and this is the part where it's funny for me because I keep in my own when I play it, and I keep thinking, oh, this is so chafing. Like this is such a but at the same time, it's been so good. Is you're thinking you don't have half endurance, and which is it's like it's 0 or nothing, and at the time I was like, wow, that is a really
everyone flinches. Everyone flinches when they see that. They're like, wait, what? I have to count that shit again? Never again.
and you can't boost your endurance, and so as a result, if you have a 96 energy blast, which is what my daughter's character has. and you're burning 9 endurance a pop going full bore.
And especially when I say it costs even if you miss, which everyone always forgets, right? So,
so if you're speed 5, you're going to burn through 45 endurance points in a turn, which is more than what you have. Then you're going to be like, and one thing that, Abby realized really quickly when she was playing, first couple of combats, and she just, she throws the whole thing in there, and then she's like, oh, I've just expended most of my endurance.
Right, I gotta duck behind somewhere and breathe.
Exactly, it's phase 5.
There's been some very, very good outcomes in our games about that, because I'm playing the villains honestly, and when they all start staggering and trying to strategize their recoveries and trying to clock each other on the other one's recovery and stuff like that, because you're not going to abort to a dodge if you're trying to take a recovery. And so it's, and how close do you want to push it? Do you want to take a recovery while you're still pretty full up? And you get it. So I've seen some pretty good profiles. You kind of profile out the whole 12 segments, kind of profile them out and say who did what when. And when you get into the second turn, you see people really trying to go for the maximal hit at the right time. And I'm saying this is a much more exciting fight. It took more segments, but it's a much more exciting fight. I've had a couple of villains who were actually successfully pounding the heroes. Look at each other and go, yeah, but we're starting to suck wood. We're starting to trade off. You attack while I recover, I attack while you... We're starting to do that. We're not going to keep that up forever. Yeah, we're winning in that the heroes are all like stunned and holding their heads and going, ow. But I think they're going to outlast us. I think we better go. And so I actually had villains lose because they realized they were running out of gas and they weren't going to be able to bounce back. So
one of the things with one of the most recent blog ones, I pitted my daughter's character against the old first edition hero Starburst, who was a guy with multi-power with flight, force field, and my daughter began to realize that was what sort of how the character's power worked. Like she was kind of watching it all, watching there, it's all open, and so she began to say things like, "Well, if he just dropped he put all his power in the energy blast, I'm hitting flight because I'm trying to get away. Or if he's hitting flight, then that means that he's not playing defense.
Now I'm going to nail him." Right. Exactly. Well, exactly. It's the way to do it. I think it's fantastic.
She really tried to gain the multi-power that way. So cool.
It's a good thing though, because in many ways we could talk a little more about this. I actually was a terrible abuser of the multi-power when I was playing back in the 80s and 90s. In retrospect, in retrospect, I've decided it's actually the worst of the three. It really doesn't match. Very, very few characters have multi-powers in the comics, in the sense that they are trading off energy. And if you're going to have where you are trading off your energy, why not just go ahead and let the endurance be the thing that you're worrying about? And so, therefore, not quit as allocation of the power itself. And so then I got to thinking more about it and said, you know what? I think I'm going to make everybody mad at me. And this is for beta. Lose the energy trade-off zero-sum multi-power entirely, and instead use it as the multi-form. Use it as the full-on body of options that are zero-sum. They switch off, you're one or the other, and that's what you do. And so,
when I was
playing
in the 80s and... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you go ahead.
Oh, when I was playing in the 80s and 90s, the only place I would ever see multi-powers was the offensive battery multi-power.
That's what I'm trying to get away from, actually. Because you're using all that shit one at a time anyway. Right? You're using it one at a time anyway, so what's the multi-power part, And so...
it just became like, which setting of the offense am I going to go with? And they would dump their defense and their movement abilities outside the multi-power. So it was... And in the case of my daughter's game, like that's become like the multi-power became the power in some ways. Like she herself understands that her character has so much energy. That's her character's power, is that she has energy and she can do this with the energy or that with the energy. And but that's that's the intent of the build. It's not
right.
how it's, as you say, it's not, most people don't have that as their character concept.
Right, right. When it is, I actually think the Endurance will do a pretty good job of it, and that a person who wants to play a character like that might want to. I mean, I think I'm going with elemental control, which always in the past was the redheaded stepchild of the frameworks, and especially because nobody understood it and they always got the math wrong, and but I think I've tried to rephrase the way it's done and make it very attractive. I hope. Again.
I was sad in some ways to see it go because I thought it rewarded characters that had a holistic concept.
Sure. Well, that was the original idea. That was the original idea, and yet Steve had an interesting point for 6th edition. His thinking, and this is very valid in its trajectory, just like, these are different trajectories of design. In his thinking, the elemental control was kind of a failed first try at a Very Pool. And that when they finally came up with the Very Pool, it kind of made the elemental control redundant. And I can see his point. I can see his point. He going that direction, I get it. And then the multi-power simply becomes a relative kindergarten version of the Very Pool.
Sure.
And so that he said, okay, that's my framework. That's how, that's the concept of the way powers work. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I'm going a different way, but that makes sense. So, yeah.
I might have to look and think about retweaking her character and seeing how that does with it. But anyway.
Well, that's okay. So, go with what you got.
Sometime we'll have to talk about why I think superhero genres are so hard and how to do a good story.
I completely agree, and I'll point you to Comics Madness, my blog, which has a whole section called Story Talk, a whole topic on exactly that.
I would love to do that.
Particularly because the comics seem to show us the opposite. That there's no reason on this God's earth to write a good story in a comic book. Professionally speaking, creatively speaking, historically, where's the reward? Right. Who's going to give you a gold star for that? And the answer is nobody. And so the question then is, why and how did so many creative people, in between all the crap, manage to bust out some astonishing work? And, I mean, not only in terms of raw narration, and here is where I would give the Lee Kirby team for Fantastic Four an enormous, that's a novel, their work there. And I would say the same for Lee's work on Spider-Man, which nobody remembers. Nobody reads the Lee stories as a chunk. If you do, there's a novel there. And it's not about the death of Gwen Stacy, that's all later. If you read that, it's its own story with its own ending, and it's really quite beautiful. Nobody knows it anymore. Everyone just knows that other story. But and there are others too. There's isolated ones. There's short form ones. There's lots of great stuff. And I'm not sure if I can explain this, but Champions in particular, for a lot of people, they look back on Champions back when they played when they were younger, and they say, that's funny. We got that epic campaign that everyone's always talking about.
Right.
And they're saying, but I haven't done that since. How did I do that? How did we do that? What happened? And strangely enough, there is a way, there's something there that promotes this if we don't get distracted by other things. That's, so there's an answer. But
I think it has to do a little bit of how we view gaming too. We could talk. You and I could talk for a very long time.
Well, I hope we do. Thanks for taking the time, Robert. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And you have a great rest of your day and enjoy your game.